What's up, YouTube? So today I want to talk about a thing called voice stealing, which has the potential to absolutely ruin the punchiness of your bass line. So what exactly is it that I'm talking about? First, I'm going to do a little bit of a technical explanation, then I'm going to show you an audio example. So without further ado, let's dive in and have a look. So for this explanation, I'm going to be using the hugely scientific program called Microsoft Paint. So I guess the quickest and easiest explanation of what voice stealing is a smoothing in parameter values when you have a monophonic synthesizer. Of course, most synths deal with this slightly differently, and different synths have settings which you can change, which I'm going to dive into a little bit further in the video. However, just understanding the basis of what exactly it is going to help you to make better decisions and to understand what exactly might be causing the lack of punchiness in your bass line. So for a quick example, I'm going to try visualize a sort of envelope modulation on the screen using Microsoft Paint. Let's say we have the note being triggered over here, again over here, again over here, and again over here. So what happens with voice stealing, if you have a monophonic synth setup and your notes are overlapping or they're too close together, you don't give enough time for the parameter value to actually get to the point where it needs to be. And often synths will have some kind of smoothing involved, and this can kind of change the transient or punchiness of your bass line. So let's say, for example, we have the envelope of our bass sound coming in like this, and then it ends over here, and then we have the next note starting over here, and so on and so forth. So just excuse my terribly scientific drawing. So what actually happens behind the scenes, the first note starts at 0, right? Goes up, comes down here, and the modulation continues. When the next note is struck, essentially we're not giving enough time to process the change from this value to whatever the next value starts at. And so this creates a bit of smoothing. And so I'm sure you've heard this in a bass. If you're not too familiar with how to program a really solid psytrance bass line, where the first bass note in your sequence sounds nice and punchy, but then the second note and the third note maybe don't sound as punchy. And that's exactly because of this phenomenon, voice stealing. So there are workarounds. So let's say, for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to visualize this with different voices. So, i.e. in a polyphonic mode or two-voice duophonic mode. So let's say this envelope ends over here, right? I'm going to use a different color to show the next envelope. So because there's no data on this voice already, it has time to kind of process and come in exactly at the kind of curve or value that it needs to. I hope I'm making sense here. So yes, in this context, like in this visualization here, we have a bit of that audio that overlaps there. But if you just program the release and decay and sustain of your synth so that it ends before the next note starts, not only are you going to have a super clean sound that doesn't overlap with the next one, but each voice is going to generate its own parameter value for that envelope. And thus, it's not going to have that smoothing when those two envelopes are overlapped. Does that make sense? So in Vital, by default, it's actually not too bad. Because in the advanced menu, you'll actually notice here there's a setting called voice override. And by default, it's set to kill. If we set it to steal, you'll start to notice exactly what I'm talking about. Do you see what happens when we change the amount of voices when it's in steal mode as opposed to kill mode? So kill mode is much better. However, you can still get a much better response if you just leave your voice settings at polyphonic and don't set your bass synth to monophonic. Also, another bonus is to use envelope mode on your LFOs, set them to a 1/16th and get it to modulate the level of your oscillator. Because then what happens is you can guarantee that value is going to hit 0 at every 16th. That way there'll be no audio overlap and you'll get that perfect transient with every single hit of the note. Do you see how when we have enough voices, changing the mode between kill or steal doesn't actually affect the bass sound? So I hope that outlines that for you. What I want to do is I actually want to show you why this idea actually came about, why I thought it's actually important to explain this. Because I've been doing a lot of work in phase plant, a lot of my Patreons and viewers have been starting to get into phase plant. So this question has actually come up a few times. One thing to note about phase plant is that the filters in this section over here, the amount of voices is determined by this polyphony count here at the bottom. This section, however, generally by default sums all of your voices down to mono and then applies the filter. So if you have a bass sound being generated here and you've got your filter in the effects lanes, you may have that you may have the voice stealing phenomena being applied to your bass sound. So let's see if I can quickly just make a bass sound here and I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. I want to do two curves, one with a much quicker response. Can you hear that? That the transient of the first note in the sequence of 3 notes is much more pronounced than the transient of the second and the third note. If we set this effects lane into poly, then it applies the polyphony count onto the effects. So each of the voices is split and the modulation of the filter is per voice. So you don't get that voice stealing that's happening to the bass sound. Can you hear that? I hope it's coming through on the YouTube algorithm, but the transient of each of the 3 bass notes sounds much more pronounced, and it also sounds exactly the same now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to A-B between switching this poly on and off so you can hear it. What might also help is to use something like no TT. So I wouldn't generally use this on my bass sound, but it's a great tool to be able to outline, to really blow out the mistakes in, for example, a mix or a sound. So we're going to really hear what's happening with OTT on the sound. Do you hear that? With OTT on, or no TT in this instance, you can almost hear there's a little bit of a crackle when you've got the voice stealing characteristic happening, which is not a good thing, especially not on the bass sound where you're going to be doing this excess processing and it's going to be such a loud thing in the mix. So definitely if you're doing your filter movement, if you're doing your main filtering on your bass in the effects lanes, in phase plant, you definitely want to use this poly switch over here. That's going to basically make it usable. So, like I said, this is generally not important for the traditional filters in phase plant unless you want sounds before the filters. That's why you'd use the poly, because if you just use the filters in the generator section, which is the same as the traditional filter over here, it would automatically have that polyphonic voicing without the voice stealing being applied. Does that make sense? So we could actually just apply the same envelope here, not have to worry about the poly over there, because the poly does tend to use a little bit of extra CPU usage. So if you're going to go with a traditional filter, I would say use this one over here, unless you want to do some pre-processing before it. So like, for example, if we wanted to process it before the filter, we wouldn't be able to do that because the effects are only available here. So for example, what we could do is like add a disperser, polyphonic, then filter it after that. Awesome. That's about it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Also, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for watching my videos and subscribing to my channel, especially because it looks like we've hit that big 50K milestone that I've been shooting for so long. It kind of feels surreal, like it went so quick. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you everyone for subscribing to my channel and sharing, those who do that, and supporting me. Anyway, if you do like what I do and you want to support what I do here, the best way to do so is either via Patreon or to buy something from my store. All the links are in the description. Anyway, see you guys next time. Cheers.